Very often I receive questions and comments from people asking things like, hey Doug, I'm struggling to get my first invite at a regional and I don't really know how to make my deck any better. Do you have any advice for me? And a lot of people even come up to me at regionals and show me their deck and say, what can I do to make this better? If you're one of those players, someone that is trying to get into the competitive scene and get that first invite or that first regional top, I'm certainly here for you, and this video is going to be the video to help you out the most. Many of the questions that I get definitely can be answered in similar ways, and if you've watched the Why Nobody Plays Magic Cylinder video from a year ago, a lot of the stuff that I said in that video is going to be applied here, just in a slightly different context, not so much focusing on Magic Cylinder, but just cards in general. But yeah, some of it might sound a little bit repeating because I actually said it in a video a year ago. Anyway, without further ado, let's talk about how to make optimal card choices. And now, yes, I'm not like a YCS winner, I'm not the best player out there, but I do think I'm better than average and I know how to help people get their invites. I've had lots of players come up to me and say, hey, you actually were able to, with your videos, help me get that first invite. So I'm going to sort of pass on some more knowledge to you guys. So here's the deal. When you're building a deck, when you're putting cards in there, you want to be playing cards that will give you the most wins the most often. I say this because this is where the debate with Magic Cylinder comes out, and yes, you might win some games with Magic Cylinder, but you won't win the most games with Magic Cylinder, and that's very important when you go to a tournament. You're not just trying to win a couple games, you're not just trying to win half your games, you're trying to win enough games to get that X2 and go actually get your invite. That's a pretty big difference because cards will win you some games. Every card can win you some games, even something like Sparks. You know, we were just doing a Duel Links live stream and my opponent got down to 100 and I wasn't able to quite do that last 100, and yeah, those are some situations where Sparks would have actually ended the game. But Sparks isn't a card that will win you the most games possible, it's a card that will win you some games and not a lot of them. So we're trying to play, whenever you're building a deck, you're trying to play the cards that will give you the most wins possible at a given tournament. I know for a lot of people that might not quite make sense yet, so let me use a real example of a card that gave me some wins at some tournaments, but that I ended up cutting from my list now twice, and that is Called by the Grave in Altergeist. So I used that card when I topped the ARG Invitational, which is like the ARG version of the national tournament that the actual Konami company does, and that's pretty cool. It was really exciting for me to top that event. It's a big event, and I used 2 copies of Called by the Grave in my list. However, I took it out of my list, and I didn't play it until the last YCS, which was YCS Chicago, so there was like 4 or 5 months there where I didn't use the card in Altergeist, and then once again I played it. I thought it was a good metagame choice, but now, and I didn't get a chance to go to the regional a couple days ago because of some other issues, but when I was going to go to the regional, the Indianapolis regional, I had my deck list ready and I didn't play Call by the Grave in that deck list anymore. Call by the Grave is an excellent example, at least in Altergeist, of a card that when I played it, it definitely won me a few games, but after tournaments, when I was doing my analysis on which cards I could cut, how I could tweak my deck to make it a little bit better so I could hopefully get that regional top or YCS top, I noticed that Call by the Grave, of all the cards in my list, was probably the lowest percentage winning card out of all of them. And it's not a card that had a negative win percentage, especially if you look at like the ARG Invitational. I went X1 in Swiss. I only lost 1 game. So obviously a card like Call by the Grave, it's really hard looking at a card in a tournament where you're actually doing well and saying, well, how can I do even better? How can I win more games? What were the games that I lost and how can I take those and learn from those? And which cards may have contributed to those losses? And there were a few solid reasons that I played Call by the Grave in Altergeist at YCS Chicago. It's really good in the mirror match for hitting my Lucy and even banishing a multi-faker in your opponent's graveyard or dodging an Altergeist manifestation. Really good against Sky Strikers for hitting Ray, because Ray can be kind of hard when you go second, and also, maybe more so than anything, it's really good at countering Ash Blossom. Now, whether or not the Ash Blossom is being used on Pot of Extravagance or Personal Spoofing or any other card, Ash Blossom at the right time can actually be really painful for an Altergeist player. So that's why I played Call by the Grave, and all of those things are pretty much the same as I played them at the ARG Invitational, except for Extravagance, because that card wasn't out. But pretty much those are the things that I was using Call by the Grave against: hand traps, Ray, and then cards in the mirror match. And while the card did certainly resolve a few times, when I sat down after YCS Chicago and said, well, what games was I losing and which cards weren't actually helping me out, I noticed a few things. One of the things that I noticed is that out of all the times that I resolved Extravagance, which is about 12 to 15 times out of 11 rounds, I only got Ash Blossomed twice, and only one of those times Called by the Grave was in my hand already, because the Called by the Grave is a card that you have to have when your opponent uses the hand trap so you can immediately banish it and negate its effect. So out of all those times that I used Extravagance, Ash Blossom was only used twice, and one of those times I had the Called by the Grave, but more importantly, the other time that I didn't have the Called by the Grave, I still was able to win that game just because it didn't matter. I mean, your opponent is just taking a 1-for-1 trade with the Ash Blossom, so you're not losing that much advantage over there. You have 4 cards, your opponent has 5 cards, but a lot of times you can quickly make back that advantage by summoning my Lucic or summoning Marionetter, so I didn't think that it was actually that good in practice. And while there were some times where I was able to banish a Ray or banish my Lucic in the mirror match, a lot of those times it didn't really matter in the long run, and actually I found that Call by the Grave in a few cases conflicted with cards like Imperial Order or Secret Village of the Spellcasters. There was one time I remember where my opponent was able to run over my monster, and I had 2 Call by the Grave face down with a Secret Village, and seeing I didn't control a Spellcaster monster, I could no longer use that card. So Call by the Grave, while it did win me some games, and while it probably had a positive win percentage, I didn't actually feel it was the strongest card in my deck, and in fact I felt it was the weakest card in my deck. This meant that when I was constructing my deck for the Indianapolis Regional, Call by the Grave was the first card that I went to in terms of cutting it to make space for better cards. Now that I've talked about my own personal experience with a card and sort of talked about how optimizing card choices can make a difference in tournament play, let's talk about a few other examples. An excellent example that I think comes up is that when you're playing competitively and you're looking at one expensive card and one cheap card, even if they both do almost the same thing, competitive players, the ones that have the budget to purchase those cards, they're looking to play the cards that give them the highest win percentage, even if it's only like a couple percent higher. An example of this is Effect Veiler versus Infinite Impermanence. In a lot of cases, outside of Altergeist especially, these two cards do almost the same thing. They're really, really close. But there are several cases, those sort of fringe cases, where Infinite Impermanence actually is much better than Effect Veiler. For example, it's a lot less restrictive in when you can activate it. Sure, you have to control no cards to use it from your hand immediately, but there are plenty of cases where you can use it just from your hand during your opponent's battle phase or during your turn, where Effect Veiler wouldn't be able to be activated because Effect Veiler is restricted to your opponent's main phase, and there are lots of other phases and lots of areas during your own turn where you'd want to use the Impermanence. It really helps when you're going second as well and you open Impermanence as your 6th card and you can actually use it against your opponents like Titan or Colossus, where if you drew Effect Veiler you wouldn't be able to activate it. Infinite Impermanence also has an excellent ability when you actually are able to set it and then use it to negate your opponent's back row, and it really punishes bad card placement against worse players, and that's something that Effect Veiler simply can't do. So Impermanence at its best, you can use it on your own turn, which is really cool, something that Effect Veiler can't do, and also you can use it against your opponent's back row, which makes Infinite Impermanence a 2-for-1. You're negating 2 cards for just that 1 Impermanence. These things might not come up every game or even most games, but the fact that they come up at all is enough reason for many players like myself to play the Impermanence over Effect Veiler. Now, of course, if you are a budget player, you can't play Infinite Impermanence, and that's all fine, but if you're looking at those highest percentage plays, those highest percentage cards, you're going to be wanting to play cards like Infinite Impermanence, even if they almost do the same thing as Effect Veiler, just because those cases where it's different from Effect Veiler really matter in the long run of your tournament experience. But what's really cool is that you can actually use the same ideas as far as optimizing card choices and optimizing what themes you play and what strategies you take to certain tournaments. Here's what I'm talking about. There are plenty of decks that I've made that use Brilliant Fusion, and in a lot of those decks, the worst ones, Brilliant Fusion was the best card in the entire deck. And what I mean by that is that there are decks that I've played where if you draw the archetype cards only, something like pre-Guru Subterrors, those are like the worst hands in your deck. And the decks that you play where you only want to draw the power cards and non-theme cards like Brilliant Fusion are like 1-for-1 or Soul Charge, a lot of the times those decks end up being much, much weaker than decks that can actually handle drawing all archetype cards. This might seem crazy, but what I'm trying to say is that if you play a deck where the best cards in the strategy are the ones that aren't actually on theme, you probably might want to look into playing a different deck where the on-theme cards are great. There was a time in my life where I said if a deck couldn't actually win if it drew 5 archetype cards, that I probably should just never play it. And while my views aren't that extreme anymore, I think there certainly are decks out there that if you draw all theme cards, you know, maybe the deck's still okay, even if it can't play through those hands. But I think it's definitely worth looking at the deck very hard if that's the case. If you're playing a deck where if you draw 5 cards from the theme that you're trying to play and you actually can't do any combos or any big boards, you might want to reevaluate whether or not that deck is actually good or not, because in a lot of cases, if a deck can't handle drawing only archetype cards and playing out of it, well, the deck might not be as strong as you think it is if it's relying on non-archetype cards to be good. Anyway though, that's pretty much going to wrap up today's discussion video. Hopefully you enjoyed the actual analysis of a card that I felt was strong but not strong enough, as well as some of the discussions about other cards as well. I'll see you later though. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.